The average American leaves thousands of dollars sitting in a bank account that quietly loses purchasing power every single year. Not because they spend too much, not because they make bad decisions, simply because they were told there was only one place to keep their money. My grandfather never believed that. Every Friday afternoon, after cashing his paycheck, he would stop at the exact same small community bank on the edge of town. But strangely, he almost never left his money there. As a child, I thought it made no sense. Why walk into a bank only to move your money somewhere else? One afternoon, when I finally asked him, he smiled the way older people sometimes do when they know you're asking the right question years before you're ready for the answer. He said something I didn't understand until much later. Banks are wonderful places to move money. Then he paused. They're not always the best places to keep it. At the time, I laughed. After all, where else would anyone keep their savings? Isn't that exactly what banks are for? That single sentence stayed in the back of my mind for nearly 20 years. It came back the day we cleaned out his house after he passed away. Inside an old metal filing cabinet, tucked beneath tax returns, warranty papers, and faded utility bills, sat a thin brown folder. Across the front, written in blue ink, were 4 simple words. Money must keep working. Inside wasn't a secret investment. There weren't stock certificates. There wasn't a hidden fortune. Instead, there were handwritten notes, interest statements, a few newspaper clippings, and one account statement from a place I had never heard him mention before. That account had earned money, during years when his regular checking account earned almost nothing. Not because he was taking bigger risks, not because he had insider knowledge, and definitely not because he was wealthy. He simply understood something that millions of Americans were never taught. What I eventually discovered surprised me for one simple reason. Everything he wrote was completely legal, available to almost anyone, and hiding in plain sight. The strange part wasn't that this account existed. The strange part was how rarely anyone talked about it. Because for most people, once a paycheck lands in a checking account, the money simply stops working. It waits. The bank keeps using it. And the customer assumes that's just how banking works. My grandfather didn't. Stay with me, because in a few minutes I'll show you the question he asked every payday, a question that completely changed where he kept his savings, and one that most bank customers never think to ask. And before this story is over, I'll show you the small $0 switch that turned idle cash into money that quietly kept paying him year after year, without changing how he earned a single dollar. When I spread my grandfather's papers across the dining room table, one thing immediately stood out. The account statements weren't all from the same place. There was his ordinary checking account, where his paycheck always arrived. There was a small savings account. And then there was another account that seemed to appear again and again over the years. Whenever his savings reached a certain amount, the money quietly moved. Sometimes only a few $100s, sometimes a few thousand. Then months later, part of it would move back. It looked almost like he was playing a game with his own money. At first, I assumed he was chasing investment returns. Maybe he was buying stocks. Maybe he had found some risky opportunity that paid unusually well. But there were no stock confirmations, no brokerage statements, no complicated investment reports, only ordinary bank paperwork. That confused me even more. If everything stayed inside the banking system, why keep moving the money? I eventually asked an old family friend who had known my grandfather for decades. He laughed. Your grandfather hated lazy dollars. I wasn't sure what he meant. He explained that Grandpa believed every dollar had one of 2 jobs. It was either working or waiting. And waiting, he often said, was usually the most expensive thing money could do. That sentence sounded strange until I looked at something most people never bother to calculate. Inflation. Imagine leaving $10,000 in an account that earns almost nothing. The number on the screen doesn't change very much. It still says $10,000. It feels safe. But every year, that same money quietly buys a little less than it did before. Groceries cost more. Insurance costs more. Electric bills rise. Home repairs become more expensive. The money looks exactly the same. Its buying power doesn't. My grandfather used to compare it to storing firewood outside without covering it. From a distance, the pile looks just as big. Month after month, it still fills the corner of the yard. But rain gets in. Moisture spreads. Little by little, it loses the very thing that made it valuable. You don't notice the change in a single day. You notice it years later. Money works the same way. That may be the quietest cost most families never see. Not because someone steals their savings overnight, but because time slowly takes away what those savings can actually buy. And here's where the story becomes interesting. For most of American history, banks competed fiercely for deposits. If they wanted your savings, they often had to offer something attractive in return. But over time, something changed. Checking accounts became the center of people's financial lives. Paychecks were deposited automatically. Bills were paid automatically. Debit cards replaced cash. And millions of people gradually stopped asking one very simple question. What is my money actually earning while it sits here? That question sounds almost too obvious. Yet surveys have repeatedly shown that many Americans couldn't tell you the interest rate on their primary bank account. Not because they aren't intelligent, because almost nobody ever asks. Banks don't have to remind customers whose money never moves. After all, a customer who leaves thousands of dollars sitting quietly in the lowest paying account is an extremely predictable customer. The less often people compare options, the less often banks have to compete for their savings. That doesn't make banks villains. Every business wants loyal customers. But it does explain why the easiest account to open isn't always the one that works hardest for your money. My grandfather understood that long before comparison websites existed. He had one simple rule written in the margin of that brown notebook. Your paycheck may arrive in one account. That doesn't mean your savings should stay there. At first, I thought it was just another one of his old sayings. Later, I realized it was the foundation of everything else. And what I'm about to show you next is the little 5-minute habit he repeated almost every payday, a habit that quietly separated the money meant for spending from the money meant to keep growing, without taking bigger risks or working longer hours. Because the real secret wasn't the account itself. It was knowing when money should leave one account, and why almost nobody ever does. For years, I assumed my grandfather had discovered some forgotten financial product that only older people knew about. The truth was much simpler. And somehow, that made it even more surprising. The account wasn't hidden. It wasn't reserved for wealthy investors. It didn't require thousands of dollars to open. It wasn't created through a special program or offered only to bank insiders. It had been available all along. The difference was that most people never bothered to compare it with the account they already had. My grandfather always said banks organize money into different rooms. One room is built for spending. Another is built for saving. The mistake most people make is trying to use one room for both jobs. Think about your own paycheck. It arrives. You buy groceries. You pay rent or the mortgage. The electric bill gets drafted automatically. Your debit card handles everything else. That is exactly what a checking account is designed to do. Money flows in. Money flows out. Convenience comes first. Growth rarely does. My grandfather had nothing against checking accounts. He simply refused to leave extra money sitting there after it had finished its job. Once the monthly bills were covered, once enough cash remained for everyday expenses, everything else was moved. Not because he expected to become rich overnight, because he believed idle money should at least try to keep up with the cost of living. He once compared it to hiring two farmhands. If one man works all day while the other sits on the porch, he told me, don't be surprised when only one earns his supper. Money, he believed, worked the same way. The first time I compared one of his old statements with my own bank account, I finally understood. His spending account earned almost nothing. Mine earned almost nothing. No surprise there. But the second account, the one he quietly moved his savings into every payday, earned several times more. Not enough to make headlines, not enough to retire early, but enough that year after year, the difference kept growing. A few dollars became a few dozen became a few hundred. Then hundreds became thousands over the course of decades. Not because of luck, not because he picked winning stocks, simply because he refused to let cash sleep when it could still be working. That was the lesson I completely missed as a child. I thought Grandpa was moving money because he distrusted banks. In reality, he understood them. Banks have different products because different money has different jobs. The paycheck you're spending next Tuesday doesn't need to earn much. The savings you won't touch for 6 months? That's an entirely different story. Here's something that surprised me even more. When I started asking friends where they kept their emergency fund, many gave almost the exact same answer: my regular bank account. Then I'd ask a second question: do you know what it's earning? Most had no idea. Not because they were careless. Because life gets busy. People compare mortgage rates. They compare car insurance. They compare cell phone plans. But the place holding thousands of dollars in savings often goes unquestioned for years. Banks understand that. The longer money stays where it is, the less often they have to compete for it. That's one reason Grandpa never treated banking as a decision you make once. He treated it as something worth reviewing every year, just like replacing worn tires or servicing an old truck. Because loyalty is a wonderful quality between people. It isn't always the smartest strategy for your savings. And that's when I noticed something even stranger inside his notebook. Every January, on the first page of a new year, he wrote down the exact same 4 questions. Those 4 questions determined whether his money stayed where it was or quietly moved somewhere else. Almost nobody asks them today. But by the end of this story, you'll know all 4, and the last one may save you from leaving hundreds or even thousands of dollars on the table over the next decade. The 4 questions weren't complicated. In fact, that's probably why my grandfather trusted them more than any financial forecast. Every January, he would sit at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, last year's statements, and that same brown notebook. Then he'd ask himself the first question: will I need this money soon? If the answer was yes, it stayed where it was. Convenience mattered more than earning a little extra. But if the money wasn't going to be touched for months, he believed it deserved a different job. The second question was just as simple. Is this account paying me fairly for keeping my money here? He never expected miracles. He simply refused to settle for yesterday's rates without looking at today's. Banks change. Products change. Interest rates change. He believed loyalty should never replace curiosity. The third question had nothing to do with numbers. It was about security. Can I still reach this money if life surprises me? That was why he never chased risky promises or locked away every dollar for the highest return. An emergency fund isn't much of an emergency fund if it takes weeks to reach it. He wanted his savings working, but never trapped. Then came the final question, the one he underlined every single year. Am I leaving this money here because it's the best place, or because changing it feels like work? That question stopped me cold. Because if I was honest, most of my financial decisions weren't really decisions at all. They were habits. My paycheck went to the same account because it always had. My savings stayed there because moving them sounded like something I'd do later. Later became next month. Next month became next year. And before I knew it, years had passed. I realized that was exactly what Grandpa had been trying to avoid. Not bad decisions. Unquestioned ones. Banks aren't hoping you make reckless choices. But they certainly don't mind when customers stop asking questions. Because the easiest customer to keep is the one who never compares, never reviews, and never moves. That's why the little brown folder wasn't a guide to getting rich. It was a reminder to stay awake. To remember that money, like a garden, needs attention from time to time. Ignore it long enough, and you may not notice what's being lost until years have passed. The funny thing is, my grandfather never called it financial planning. He simply called it checking on the money. It took him less than an hour each January. Yet that small habit quietly earned him more than leaving everything on autopilot ever could. Today, I keep my own version of that brown folder. Not because I want to copy every decision he made. The world has changed. Banking has changed. Interest rates rise and fall. New accounts appear. Old ones disappear. But one lesson hasn't changed at all. Your paycheck may arrive in one account. That doesn't mean every dollar should stay there. Sometimes the smartest financial move isn't working harder. It's spending 5 minutes making sure the money you've already earned is working as hard as you did to earn it. That's the $0 switch my grandfather discovered long before comparison websites and financial apps existed. Not a secret account, not a magic loophole, just the habit of asking 4 simple questions before leaving money where everyone else leaves it without thinking. And perhaps that's why the biggest advantage was never hidden inside the account itself. It was hidden inside the question most people never ask. Is my money still working for me? That was the real lesson inside my grandfather's brown folder. It wasn't really about finding a better account. It wasn't about chasing the highest interest rate every few months. It was about awareness, knowing where your money is sitting, understanding what it's doing while you sleep, and making sure every dollar has the job that's right for it. The truth is, most people don't lose money all at once. They lose it quietly. A few dollars in missed interest here. Years spent leaving savings in the wrong place there. A habit repeated for so long that it no longer feels like a choice. My grandfather understood that money standing still slowly falls behind. That's why he never stopped asking questions. Not because he distrusted banks, but because he knew that no one would ever pay more attention to his savings than he would. And perhaps that's the lesson worth remembering today. Financial security doesn't always come from earning a bigger paycheck. Sometimes it comes from making sure the money you've already earned is working as hard as you did to earn it. My grandfather's system wasn't powerful because it fought banks. It was powerful because it refused to leave money idle simply out of habit. And that's exactly what his little $0 switch accomplished for an entire lifetime. But by remembering that the best place for your money today isn't always the same place it was yesterday.